Elizabeth had always loved English. She enjoyed reading books and writing stories. She could even watch movies in English without needing subtitles. But there was one big problem. She was afraid to speak English in front of others. Whenever she tried to speak, something strange would happen. Her hands would get sweaty, her heart would start beating fast, and she felt like everyone was watching her. Sometimes her voice would shake, and other times she couldn't find the right words. She would open her mouth to say something, but her mind would go completely blank. At school, Elizabeth's classmates spoke English confidently. They answered questions, gave presentations, and even talked to teachers without fear. She admired them and wished she could do the same. But every time she tried to speak, she felt like she would make a mistake. What if she said the wrong word? What if people laughed at her? These thoughts made her nervous, so she chose to stay quiet. Elizabeth often avoided speaking in English. If someone asked her a question in class, she would quickly answer in a very short sentence or just nod. If a teacher asked for volunteers to read, she would look down at her notebook, hoping they wouldn't pick her. She knew she needed to practice speaking, but the fear of making mistakes stopped her every time. At home, Elizabeth was different. She would talk to herself in English when no one was around. She would stand in front of the mirror and pretend to have conversations. But as soon as she had to speak in front of real people, her confidence disappeared. One day, something happened that made Elizabeth even more nervous. Her professor, Mr. Carter, walked into the classroom with a big smile on his face. He clapped his hands and said, "I have an exciting announcement." The whole class became silent, waiting to hear what he had to say. "Next month, our school is going to have a debate competition," he said. "The topic is the power of communication." Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest. A debate competition? That meant standing in front of a large audience and speaking in English. She felt a wave of panic wash over her. There was no way she could do that. Mr. Carter continued, "This is a great chance for all of you to improve your speaking skills. Communication is very important in life. The more we practice, the more confident we become." He looked around the room and added, "I hope many of you will participate." Elizabeth looked at her classmates. Some of them were already whispering excitedly, eager to join the competition. She wished she could feel the same way, but instead, she felt afraid. After class, Elizabeth stayed behind while her classmates left. She had so many thoughts in her head. Should she try to participate? Could she really stand in front of an audience and speak? What if she failed? Mr. Carter noticed that she looked worried. He walked up to her and said, "Elizabeth, are you thinking about joining the debate?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I want to, but I'm afraid." "What if I make mistakes?" she asked. Mr. Carter smiled kindly. "Making mistakes is part of learning," he said. "Nobody speaks perfectly at first. The important thing is to practice and keep trying. Confidence comes with time." Elizabeth sighed. She wanted to believe him, but the fear inside her was too strong. "I don't know if I can do it," she admitted. "Tell you what," Mr. Carter said. "Why don't you practice speaking a little every day? Start small. Talk to a friend, read out loud, or even practice in front of a mirror. Little by little, you will get better." Elizabeth thought about this. Maybe if she practiced, she could improve. Maybe she could find a way to overcome her fear. That evening, she went home and stood in front of her mirror. She took a deep breath and said, "Hello, my name is Elizabeth, and today I will talk about communication." At first, her voice was shaky, and she felt silly talking to herself. But she remembered what Mr. Carter said. She had to start small. The next day, she decided to take another step. She went to her best friend, Sarah, and said, "Can I practice my speech with you?" Sarah smiled and said, "Of course." Elizabeth read her speech out loud. She stumbled over a few words, but kept going. Sarah clapped when she finished. "That was great," she said. "You just need to believe in yourself." Each day, Elizabeth practiced a little more. She read out loud in class when the teacher asked. She tried to answer questions in full sentences instead of short answers. Slowly, she started feeling more comfortable. But the real challenge was still ahead, the debate competition. Could she really stand in front of so many people and speak? As the competition day grew closer, Elizabeth felt nervous again. But this time, she reminded herself of all the practice she had done. She had worked hard. She had faced her fears step by step. Maybe she wasn't perfect yet, but she had come so far. The night before the debate, she stood in front of the mirror and said, "I can do this." And for the first time, she started to believe it. The next morning, as she walked into the debate hall, her heart was still racing. But she took a deep breath and remembered Mr. Carter's words. Confidence comes with time. Keep trying. She stepped onto the stage, looked at the audience, and began to speak. Elizabeth was determined to improve. She knew she couldn't let her fear control her anymore. So, she decided to seek help from someone she trusted, her English professor, Mr. Carter. One afternoon, after class, Elizabeth stayed behind and walked up to his desk. Her hands felt sweaty, and her heart was pounding, but she gathered her courage and spoke. "Sir, I want to speak English confidently, but I always get nervous," she admitted. "I forget words, and my voice shakes. I don't know what to do." Mr. Carter listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. Then, with a kind smile, he said, "Elizabeth, confidence doesn't come overnight, but I promise you, with practice, you will get better. The key is not to aim for perfection, but to focus on expressing yourself." Elizabeth was confused. "But, sir, what if I make mistakes?" He chuckled. "Everyone makes mistakes, even native speakers. The important thing is to keep going and learn from them." Then Mr. Carter gave her 3 simple but powerful rules to follow. 1. Speak slowly and clearly. There was no need to rush her words. If she spoke too fast, she might get stuck or forget what she wanted to say. Speaking slowly would help her think and pronounce words correctly. 2. Think in English. Instead of translating from her first language, she should train her mind to think in English. That way, words would come naturally instead of feeling forced. 3. Practice every day. Even if she didn't have someone to talk to, she could practice alone, talking to herself in the mirror or reading aloud. The more she spoke, the more confident she would become. Elizabeth listened carefully, writing down the tips in her notebook. She knew this was going to be a challenge, but she was ready to try. That evening, when Elizabeth got home, she stood in front of her mirror. She felt a little silly at first, but then she remembered Mr. Carter's advice. Taking a deep breath, she began speaking. "Hello, my name is Elizabeth. Today, I went to university, and I learned something very important." She talked about her day, describing everything in English. "I ate lunch with my friends. We talked about our homework. The weather was nice today. I wore my favorite blue sweater." At first, she struggled. Sometimes she forgot words, and sometimes she paused for too long. But she didn't stop. She reminded herself, it's okay to make mistakes. I just have to keep going. The next day, Elizabeth tried something new. She took out her phone and recorded herself speaking. She talked about her morning routine. "I wake up at 7 a.m. I brush my teeth. I eat breakfast. Today I ate eggs and toast. Then I got ready for university." After recording, she listened to herself. She noticed some mistakes, but instead of feeling discouraged, she smiled. "I can hear my mistakes, and that means I can fix them," she thought. Every day, she practiced a little more. She described things around her in English. She thought in English, and she spoke out loud whenever she had the chance. Elizabeth still wasn't perfect, but she was improving. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. The day of the debate had finally arrived. Elizabeth stood backstage, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She took deep breaths, but her hands were still shaking. All around her, students were preparing. Some were reading their notes. Others were whispering their speeches under their breath. Elizabeth clutched the small paper in her hands, but the words seemed to blur. What if I forget everything? What if my voice shakes? What if people laugh at me? She squeezed her eyes shut and took a deep breath. Then, she heard a voice in her mind, Mr. Carter's voice. Speak slowly and clearly. Take your time. The goal is to express yourself, not to be perfect. She opened her eyes. It was time. Elizabeth walked onto the stage, her legs feeling like jelly. The bright light shone on her, and the audience was completely silent. Hundreds of eyes were watching her, waiting for her to speak. For a moment, she wanted to turn and run, but then she remembered all the practice she had done, the hours of speaking in front of the mirror, the recordings, the small victories. She took a deep breath, stood tall, and began. The power of communication is not just about speaking. It is about connecting, about making people understand you. Her voice wavered a little, and she stumbled over a word. But instead of panicking, she did something surprising. She smiled. She corrected herself, took another deep breath, and kept going. As she spoke, something amazing happened. The fear in her heart started to fade. She wasn't just reading a speech anymore. She was speaking from her heart. She saw people in the audience nodding, listening to her words. Some even smiled in encouragement. She felt stronger. Her voice grew clearer. She was not just speaking, she was communicating. By the time she reached the last sentence of her speech, she no longer felt nervous. She felt proud. As soon as she finished speaking, there was silence. For a second, Elizabeth worried. Did she do something wrong? Then, suddenly, the audience erupted into applause. She had done it. She had spoken in English, in front of so many people, and she had done it well. Elizabeth couldn't stop smiling. She had faced her biggest fear, and won. From that day on, she knew one thing for sure. She would never be afraid to speak English again. After the debate, Elizabeth stepped off the stage, still catching her breath. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She had done it. She had spoken in front of everyone without freezing or running away. As she walked back to her seat, her classmates surrounded her with smiles. "Elizabeth, that was amazing," one of them said. "You sounded so confident," another added. She couldn't stop smiling. These were the same classmates she had once admired for their fluency, and now they were praising her. One student came up to her and said, "I was always afraid to speak in English, but after watching you today, I think I'll try too." Elizabeth's heart swelled. She had inspired someone else. At that moment, she realized something very important. Confidence wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about not being afraid to make them. From that day on, Elizabeth kept improving. She didn't stop after the debate. She wanted to get even better. She joined an English-speaking club at her university, where students practice conversations every week. She started speaking with her classmates in English whenever she could, even if she made small mistakes. She helped other students who were shy about speaking, just like she once had been. And most importantly, she never stopped practicing. Day by day, English became a part of her life. She no longer hesitated before speaking. She didn't worry about making mistakes. She just spoke, and she spoke well. Speaking English felt natural now. She could express her thoughts easily, clearly, and with confidence. Elizabeth had once been afraid of speaking, but now she was proud of how far she had come. She knew that no matter where life took her, she would always have the power of communication on her side. Months later, Elizabeth found herself standing in front of a classroom filled with nervous students. She could see the same fear in their eyes that she had once felt. The fear of speaking, the fear of making mistakes. But this time, she wasn't the one learning. She was the one teaching. She smiled warmly and said, "I know exactly how you feel. I was just like you once, afraid to speak, afraid to make mistakes. But do you know what I learned? The students leaned in, listening closely. Confidence isn't something you're born with. It's something you build. She shared her journey, the hesitation, the practice, the debate, and finally, the joy of speaking fluently. She told them about her mistakes, her fears, and how she had pushed past them. The secret is simple, she continued. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep trying. Speak every day, even if it's just a little. Don't be afraid of mistakes. They are part of learning. The students nodded, their eyes lighting up with hope. Some even smiled, feeling a little braver. That day, Elizabeth helped others find their voice, just as she had found hers. And as she looked around the room, she knew that this was just the beginning. A new group of confident English speakers was about to be born. Do you want to speak English confidently like Elizabeth? The secret is simple. Practice, don't fear mistakes, and believe in yourself. If this story inspired you, comment, and subscribe to English Tone for more stories that make learning English easy and exciting. Keep practicing, and one day, you'll speak with confidence too.